Hey there, our Think Tank 11. I just saw your video on gun control, and I was going to comment, and then I realized it's much easier just to make a video. Um, you made a couple points and asked some questions at the end, and I thought I'd address some of them. First, I think you laid out a false dichotomy by saying that the two sides of the debate are a total ban and those who would mandate that everyone own a gun. Now, you made sure to clarify that those are the extremes, but I would disagree because I've never heard anybody who advocates that there should be a mandate for everybody to own a gun. I know it actually passed in a town in Georgia, but it's not enforced. You can look at the most radical pro-gun organizations in this country, and none of them say that you should be required to own a gun. So I don't believe that that's a fair representation. There are, of course, people who call for total bans, but even they are pretty rare. Moving on, you said that you favor background checks, even IRS checks. There's no evidence at all that background checks reduce crime or have any effect on the availability of guns for criminals. There currently are background checks on all sales at licensed dealers. There have been since 1994, and there's no evidence that crime went down because of this. Of course, the government has attempted to show this many times through studies, but none of the studies have shown this to be true. It's not impossible, but there are also states that have more strict rules. There are some states that require background checks on all sales, even private sales, and then there are other states where there are no checks on private sales, and there's no correlation that shows that the more stringent laws actually lower crime in any way. Now, what you're using, and you use it a couple times, is a fallacy where you think of a hypothetically possible situation and then just assume that, you know, if the policy could hypothetically affect the situation, then it's justified. So it is possible that, you know, a felon or somebody could want to commit a crime, and it is conceivable that a background check could in some way hinder them. It's possible, but statistically, in terms of everything we know from criminal science, is that won't actually work that way. Anybody intent on committing a crime will be aware that there's a background check, and so they'll never go in and be caught by it. You will hear numbers of people who have been prosecuted. None of them appear to be felons who were about to commit a murder and went into the gun store and got caught. Almost all of them are false positives, or people who didn't realize that they had a record, so something from many years in the past, even decades. And even though the system will make a hit, will say, oh, a felon tried to buy the gun, almost none of, and you'll hear big numbers, you'll hear tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. The number of those that actually result in any kind of prosecution is measured in the dozens. And there again, they're not people who are about to commit a crime. They're people who maybe committed a crime 30 years ago, didn't even realize that it was on their records, and went in and didn't realize that they were breaking a law. They weren't people about to do a crime. And I further reiterate that there's no evidence, empirical evidence, that background checks do anything. So, what your basis for thinking that would help? I mean, you didn't provide any other than the hope. The other thing is, you said that they should be severely taxed. Well, I'll come to that in a second. You said a ban that fully automatic weapons should be banned. Now, this makes me think that you're not quite sure what you're talking about, because currently fully automatic weapons in the United States are almost completely banned. They're not totally banned. It is legal to get a fully automatic weapon if you have a Class 3, I forget what it's called, a Class 3 FFL license. And the requirements to get it are far more stringent than anything you outlined in your video. You have to pass background checks. You have to sign a waiver saying that they can do spot checks whenever they want. You do have to pay tax. It's fairly considerable, and for anybody else, they're not legal to own. So while you would say fully automatic weapons should be banned, they almost are, and the ones that are legal probably meet your standards of restriction, if not exceed them. What I think you probably meant is that certain so-called assault weapons are not illegal. Now, assault weapons is a political term. It's not a very descriptive term of the function or use of firearms. But yes, there are many semi-automatic rifles, battle rifles, black rifles, if you will, that are legal, and I'm assuming that is what you're talking about. These are not fully automatic. Some of them are designed to be capable of that, but they're sold in civilian variants that are not fully automatic. So I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's what you meant or not. But it's real common for people to say they don't think machine guns should be legal or whatever, and they're practically. I mean, they're not. You can't go to Walmart and buy a machine gun or a fully automatic weapon. And then you go to this. They should be severely taxed. And it's interesting that you would point out that this would hurt collectors. And it would hurt collectors, but the group that it would hurt the most are not rich people who can afford to collect guns. It's poor people. And this is really interesting because you actually are better than a lot of gun control advocates who are against self-defense. Several times you reference legitimate uses, and I believe, if you don't directly state it, at least seems to imply that self-defense is a legitimate purpose. However, high prices and high taxes, to the point that they would hurt wealthy collectors, would deny the rights to poor people, the people who need it the most. And there's research to show this, that, for instance, when concealed carry laws are liberalized and it's made easier to conceal carry, typically violent crime, especially homicide, will drop. Now, it's usually not very dramatic in most places, but it is the most dramatic in the heavily urbanized, very poor areas. So, for instance, Detroit infamously high homicide rate. It still has a high homicide rate. In the year 2000, the state of Michigan, where Detroit is, liberalized their concealed carry. They made it so that anybody who wants a concealed carry license must be granted one, and the murder rate in Detroit has declined significantly since then. Now, it's still very horrible, but it's not nearly what it was, and that's what the evidence shows. Now, what you're saying is that you don't think that poor people should be able to own guns for self-defense or for any reason, that they should be heavily taxed to do this, which is interesting. I don't know if you're a liberal or not. To be clear, I'm not a conservative or a Republican. I'm a libertarian. But it's interesting because there's a very high correlation. I almost never hear anybody on the quote-unquote right, or anybody who's a libertarian for sure, who advocates for stricter gun laws. Almost everybody is a liberal and somebody who would identify as wanting to help the poor or the disadvantaged, and yet you are actually advocating an extremely elitist, pro-upper class solution to say that poor people. I mean, if there's a $500 tax on a gun, or whatever the tax is, that falls disproportionately hard on poor people. The rich white people who collect guns, typically millionaires, and they can afford the inconvenience. Poor people cannot, unless you make the tax totally superfluous, like $1 or something. So there's that. I don't know if you've considered this, or if you just think that poor people shouldn't have guns, or what. You didn't say. To me, it sounded like it didn't even occur to you. Second is, there's this unstated premise that you didn't defend, that guns and their availability is inherently bad. That's, I assume, why you would support gun buybacks and the bans on things like fully automatic weapons. Again, there's no evidence that this is the case, that guns are inherently bad, that the availability of guns increases crime, or violent crime in particular. The United States, for example, many millions, I don't think 10, but it's 5 or 6 million new guns enter into the civilian hands every year or so, and this has basically always been the case. So if you look at the last 20 years, the number of guns in American hands has increased enormously. There always are a few that are destroyed or broken down or lost, but they're more than replaced. There's more, the aggregate is increasing, and yet violent crime in the United States has been decreasing for about 20 years. It reached a peak, I think, in 91 or maybe even in the early 80s, and so there's no basis really for claiming that, or asserting or insinuating that more guns equal more crime. And of course that's the assumption that predicates saying that we should have buybacks, we should restrict their access, we shouldn't let poor people have them, we should tax. I mean, you didn't say that, but by saying that they should be heavily taxed, that's in effect what you're calling for. I'd call your attention to the fact that there is no correlation with gun ownership rates and violent crime. What countries in Europe have the highest rates of gun ownership? There are countries in Scandinavia like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Germany. Germany actually has one of the highest gun ownership rates in the world. They do have what we would consider strict laws, but there's quite a few guns in Germany. And if you look at something like the UK, they have far, far fewer guns per capita. And yet, there's no correlation there. Germany has much lower crime than the UK. Switzerland's number 3, I believe. I believe it's the United States, Yemen, Switzerland. Germany is in the top 5 as well. The UK, which is interesting because most people seem to think of the UK as an example that proves the desirability of gun laws. This does not seem to be the case, because over the years the UK has enacted stricter and stricter gun control and had higher and higher rates of crime. In fact, they're the most violent country in Western Europe now, even though they do have basically the strictest gun laws in Western Europe. And this goes even further. If you look in Eastern European countries like Russia or Poland, that have essentially gun bans and very low per capita gun ownership rates, they have absolutely atrocious violent crime. But then you look at other Eastern European countries like, say, the Czech Republic, which has gun laws that are very similar to the United States and gun ownership rates that are comparable. They're not comparable to the United States, but they're high. Okay, just to be clear, the United States has incomparably high gun ownership rates. The only country that's even close is Yemen, and the third one is Switzerland, and it's, I think in the United States it's close to 1-to-1. Some people will say 80%. For every one person there's 0.8 guns. In Switzerland, I think it's like 0.4 or 0.5. In any event, there isn't a correlation there. You look at countries like Brazil. Brazil has quadruple the homicide rate of the United States. Quadruple. But less than a tenth the gun ownership rate. So again, you have this insinuation in there that more guns equal more crime, but there's no evidence to that. So I would ask that you look into that more. Find the correlative study that proves it, and what degree correlation, because I've never seen it. I've heard it anecdotally. So people will say the U.S. and the U.K. That's just two examples. You can't come to a scientific study, and there's good evidence, and that's not the reason. Again, using that, if you look at my videos, I actually did a whole video just on comparing the U.S. and the U.K. In terms of guns. So I'm not going to get all into it here, but I would say that's an unsupported assertion. And the other thing, so far I've only addressed the empirical problems, but there's also moral and ethical questions. You have the right to purchase things. You shouldn't be presumed guilty. You shouldn't have to prove your innocence in order to do something. Now, I believe in private property. If a gun store wants to do a background check, that's their business. And most gun stores are aware how bad it would look if they just gave guns to people that were going to go off the wall, go on rampages, so they don't. But the premise that you're coming from is that we have the presumption of guilt, that we shouldn't be allowed to own a gun. Some guns you don't think we should be allowed to own at all. And again, I didn't want to get into it, but there's no evidence that banning fully automatic weapons or restricting them reduces crime. there was a crime wave in the 1930s. That's when they passed the ban that they largely restricted them. But the crime wasn't because fully automatic weapons suddenly became available. Fully automatic weapons were available to the public from when they were first invented up until that point, which was about 40 years. The problem was prohibition. Prohibition of alcohol caused a spike in crime. And rather than say, oh, we made a mistake in prohibiting alcohol, one of the things the government did was to restrict fully automatic weapons. Similar, right now, a large majority of our homicides in the United States are related to the drug war. All right, and it's safe to assume that even if they weren't all eliminated, if we ended the drug war, the homicide rate might well be half what it is. In fact, it might be even only 30% what it is. Speculative, I know, but again, you have these assumptions, but they're not really backed up by anything. Like, you know, maybe they seem reasonable, but if you really analyze them, they're not. And I don't think that you can deny someone their rights, their liberties, on an unbacked assumption. And again, you say these hypothetical things. You don't think that fully automatic weapons should be allowed because then it's hypothetically possible that you could go and kill a whole bunch of people. That's true. But you know, by that same reasoning, we shouldn't let anybody have a gun because it's hypothetically possible that everyone with a gun might one day all commit suicide. Because it's physically possible, right? I mean, I could take my guns and shoot myself in the head, and 10 million other Americans who own guns can do the same thing, right? It's hypothetically possible. It can't be. You can't say that the gravity prevents this or anything. And so, by that line of reasoning, then they should just be completely banned. But then we could say anything. Cars can be banned. Bleach should be banned. Anything. You can't. Concocting a hypothetical example is not sufficient evidence to ban something. You have to bear in mind how likely that is to be even used. You know, if you don't, and as it stands right now, the most common guns used in crime by far are handguns. They're not fully automatic weapons. They're not even hunting rifles or the sniper rifles you talked about. Oh, and you said there's no use for fully automatic weapons. That's of course incorrect. There's recreational uses, but they can be used in self-defense, and they have been used in self-defense. I remember seeing a story not too long ago of a guy who's like 20 gang members were basically assaulting his house, and he came out with an AK-47. And that ended it right there. Now, if you came out with just your double-barreled shotgun, you will not intimidate 20 gang members. Probably. I mean, you could, I guess, but AK-47, which I think is what you're referring to. You said automatic weapons, but those are already basically banned, so I think you must have been imagining like AK-47s. They do have legitimate uses. I've fired them, and I can tell you when I shot, I don't own an AK-47, but when I fired them before, I didn't do anything illegal, I didn't do anything wrong, so how is that not legitimate? You know, if I go target practicing with my assault weapon, how is that not a legitimate purpose? You know, you can't say, well, you could have taken it. Yeah, I could have, but that's not very likely. And so, this is way long, but you know, it's a big topic. So I apologize for making it long, but I just ask you to consider those things, please.